November 12, 1943. Norfolk, Virginia. The transport ship USS Henry Gibbons lurches against the harbor dock, its hull scarred from Atlantic crossings through U-boat-infested waters. In the cargo hold below deck, Grenadier Otto Lehmann presses his palm against the cold metal wall, feeling the vibrations as the engines finally go silent. For 6 days, he and 847 other captured German soldiers have existed in a state of suspended terror, crammed into compartments designed for freight, not human cargo. The propaganda films shown in Wehrmacht training camps had been explicit. American prison ships were floating torture chambers where captured Germans were starved, beaten, and often thrown overboard before reaching land. Otto had watched those films 3 times, memorizing every horrific detail, preparing himself for the inevitable brutality that awaited any soldier unfortunate enough to fall into enemy hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The heavy door to the hold screeches open. Harsh winter sunlight floods the darkness, and Otto squints against the brightness, his eyes having adjusted to 6 days of dimness interrupted only by a single flickering bulb. American voices echo down the metal stairs, but there's something wrong with the tone. These voices lack the sadistic edge Otto had expected. They sound almost bored, mechanical, like factory workers processing shipments rather than executioners preparing victims. A figure appears in the doorway, silhouetted against the light. As Otto's vision adjusts, he sees an American officer in a pressed uniform that looks impossibly clean compared to the filth and grime coating every German prisoner below. The officer speaks in English, his words incomprehensible to most of the men, then switches to heavily accented but functional German. "Gentlemen, you will exit the ship in orderly fashion. You will be processed, medically examined, fed, and transported to your assigned facility. Any prisoner too weak to walk will be carried on stretchers. Follow instructions from the guards, and you will not be harmed." Otto glances at his comrade, Corporal Friedrich Bauer, who had been captured alongside him during the chaotic retreat from Sicily. Friedrich's face mirrors Otto's confusion. This doesn't match the script. Where are the snarling dogs? Where are the clubs and rifle butts? Where is the American savagery promised by every propaganda broadcast from Berlin? The climb up the stairs feels like ascending into an alternate reality. On deck, American soldiers stand in formation, rifles slung over shoulders rather than pointed at prisoners. Medical personnel in white coats wait beside tables laden with equipment. And most shocking of all, Otto sees steam rising from large metal containers positioned near the gangplank. His nose, dulled by days of breathing recycled air thick with the stench of seasickness and unwashed bodies, suddenly catches something that makes his empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. Food. Real food. Hot food. The processing line moves with efficient precision that Otto recognizes from his own military training, but stripped of all hostility. Each prisoner shuffles forward, weak from the voyage, filthy beyond description, and trembling with a combination of cold, fear, and exhaustion. When Otto's turn comes, an American medic gestures for him to sit. The man's hands are gentle as he checks Otto's pulse, examines his eyes, looks into his throat. Through a translator, the medic asks about injuries, illnesses, chronic conditions. Otto answers mechanically, still waiting for the trap to spring, for the kindness to reveal itself as elaborate psychological torture. Then comes the moment that will haunt Otto's understanding of reality for the rest of his life. A different American soldier, this one barely old enough to shave, places a metal tray in Otto's hands. On that tray sits more food than Otto has seen in a single meal since 1941. A thick slice of bread, actually thick, not the paper-thin rations that passed for bread in the Wehrmacht. A portion of stew with visible chunks of beef, real beef, swimming in rich gravy. Boiled potatoes. A cup of coffee that actually smells like coffee, not the acorn substitute that had become standard in the German army. And strangest of all, a small square of chocolate wrapped in paper. Otto stares at the tray. His hands shake so badly that the coffee sloshes over the rim of the cup. This has to be a trick. Perhaps the food is poisoned. Perhaps they feed prisoners well before the interrogation tortures begin. Perhaps this is all theater, designed to lower psychological defenses before the real horror starts. But his body doesn't care about perhaps. His body recognizes food, and the hunger that has been his constant companion for months overrides every cautious instinct. Otto lifts the coffee cup to his lips and drinks. The liquid is hot. Actually hot. Not lukewarm, not barely heated, but genuinely, wonderfully hot. It burns his tongue slightly, and that small pain feels like a blessing. The coffee is real, strong, with a bitterness that speaks of actual coffee beans rather than the sawdust and chicory blend he's choked down for years. Otto's throat constricts, and to his absolute horror, he feels tears beginning to form. He blinks them back furiously. He's a German soldier. He's fought across North Africa. He's survived artillery barrages and air raids. He will not cry over a cup of American coffee. But then he tastes the stew, and the carefully constructed walls of his composure begin to crack. The beef is tender, cooked until it falls apart. The gravy has depth, complexity, seasoning. The potatoes are buttery and salted just right. This isn't prison food. This isn't even normal soldier food. This is the kind of meal his mother used to make on Sundays before the war, when Germany still had butter and beef and enough of everything. Otto eats slowly at first, trying to maintain dignity, then faster as his body's desperate need overwhelms his pride. Around him, 847 other German prisoners are having identical experiences, their faces showing the same confusion, the same disbelief, the same barely suppressed emotion. Friedrich sits beside Otto, methodically working through his own tray. After several minutes of silence broken only by the sounds of eating, Friedrich whispers in German, "This is the psychological phase. They feed us well to make us compliant. Tomorrow, the real treatment begins." Otto nods, wanting to believe this explanation, needing it to make sense. But doubt has already taken root. If this is psychological manipulation, it's incredibly elaborate and expensive. That chocolate square sitting unwrapped on his tray represents more sugar than German civilians have seen in months. Why waste such resources on prisoners destined for torture? The trucks that transport them inland are military vehicles, yes, but cleaner than any transport Otto experienced in the Wehrmacht. The guards who accompany them carry weapons but don't brandish them. When one prisoner, an older man named Weber, asks in broken English about bathroom facilities, the guard actually answers politely and instructs the driver to make a stop. This casual accommodation of basic human needs feels more surreal than the hot meal. In the German army, showing weakness by requesting a bathroom break could earn you a beating from your own sergeant. These Americans simply shrug and pull over. Camp Forest in Tennessee becomes visible as the convoy crests a hill. Otto's first thought is that they've made a mistake and brought the prisoners to an American military base by accident. The facility sprawls across hundreds of acres, with neat rows of wooden barracks, administrative buildings, and what appears to be a dedicated medical complex. Watchtowers punctuate the perimeter fence, yes, and the barbed wire is real enough. But inside that fence, Otto sees German prisoners walking freely between buildings, sitting in small groups on the ground, some even playing cards in the weak November sunlight. No one is being beaten. No one is digging ditches under the lash. No one appears to be dying of starvation or torture. The intake process at Camp Forest takes 3 hours. 3 hours during which Otto is issued clean clothing, actual prisoner uniforms rather than rags. 3 hours during which he's assigned to a specific barracks, given a mattress, genuine mattress with springs and padding, issued 2 wool blankets, shown where to find toilets and showers, and informed through translators about camp rules and regulations. The rules are straightforward. Follow orders from American personnel. No escape attempts. No violence against guards or fellow prisoners. Maintain basic hygiene. Attend mandatory roll calls. In exchange for compliance, prisoners receive 3 meals daily, medical care, access to recreational facilities, permission to send limited correspondence home, and treatment in accordance with something called the Geneva Convention that Otto has never heard of but which apparently guarantees certain minimum standards for prisoners of war. That first night in the barracks, Otto lies on his assigned bunk and stares at the ceiling. The mattress beneath him feels impossibly soft after months of sleeping on bare ground or thin bedrolls. The blankets are thick enough to actually provide warmth. The barracks have a coal stove in the center, radiating heat that keeps the November chill at bay. Around him, other prisoners whisper in the darkness, their voices carrying the same bewildered tone that Otto feels in his bones. They gave us toothbrushes, someone says. Individual toothbrushes. Another voice responds, the medical officer said if we have any dental problems, they'll fix them. They have a dentist. 4 prisoners. A third man, his voice thick with suspicion, mutters, it's all fake. Tomorrow we'll wake up and find this was a dream. Or they're fattening us up before the slaughter. But tomorrow comes, and with it, breakfast. Real breakfast. Oatmeal with brown sugar. Toast with margarine. Coffee. Canned fruit. Otto eats at a long table in a mess hall that could seat 300 men, watching American guards move through the space with casual indifference. They're not monitoring every bite, not counting rations, not waiting to snatch food away. They're just there, doing a job, looking bored. One guard near Otto's table is reading a newspaper. Another yawns repeatedly. These are not men engaged in psychological warfare. These are men going through the motions of a routine shift. The days begin to establish a pattern. Morning roll call at dawn. Breakfast. Work assignments for those deemed healthy enough, usually involving maintenance around the camp or agricultural labor on nearby farms that have lost workers to the war effort. Lunch at midday. More work or free time depending on assignment. Dinner in the evening. Then several hours before lights out when prisoners can write letters, play cards, read books from the surprisingly well-stocked camp library, or simply sit and process the cognitive dissonance of being treated like human beings by the enemy they'd been taught to consider subhuman monsters. Otto's work assignment places him on a detail maintaining the camp's vegetable gardens. The work is physical but not brutal. The American civilian supervisor, an older man with weathered hands and a Tennessee accent so thick that even the translator struggles, treats the German prisoners like slightly incompetent farmhands rather than dangerous war criminals. He demonstrates proper techniques for winter preparation of garden beds, checks their work with a critical but not cruel eye, and once, when Otto accidentally cuts his hand on a garden tool, the supervisor personally escorts him to the medical facility for treatment and a bandage. The medical facility deserves its own reckoning with reality. Otto had expected a primitive aid station, perhaps a single doctor overwhelmed by hundreds of patients. Instead, he finds a fully equipped clinic with multiple examination rooms, a surgery, a dental office, a pharmacy stocked with medications that are desperately scarce in Germany, and a staff of American doctors and nurses who treat German prisoners with the same professional care they'd give their own soldiers. The nurse who cleans and bandages Otto's cut speaks no German, and Otto speaks no English, but she works with gentle efficiency, applying antiseptic that stings but cleanly, wrapping the wound in white gauze, and sending him back to his barracks with instructions conveyed through gesture and pantomime to keep the bandage dry. 3 weeks into his captivity, Otto receives his first Red Cross letter form, a standardized document allowing prisoners to send brief messages home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The form has spaces for simple statements. I am healthy. I am unhealthy. I am wounded. I am not wounded. I am working. I am not working. Otto checks the appropriate boxes, then stares at the small space allocated for personal messages. 25 words maximum. What can he possibly say in 25 words that would convey the absolute unreality of his situation? How can he explain to his wife Maria, struggling in bombed-out Hamburg with 2 small children and Nazi ration cards that provide barely enough calories to survive, that her husband is eating beef stew and sleeping on a mattress with springs? He writes, "My dearest Maria, I am alive and well. The Americans treat us fairly. I have enough food and warm shelter. I think of you and the children constantly. We will be together again. You're Otto. Even as he writes the words, he knows they sound insane. His wife will think he's writing under duress, that Americans are forcing him to send propaganda. She'll read enough food and think it's code for starvation. She'll see warm shelter and imagine he's freezing to death. The gap between German propaganda about American prison camps and the mundane reality of Camp Forest is too vast to bridge in 25 words. But Otto sends the letter anyway, drops it in the designated box in the camp administration building, and hopes that somehow, the truth will reach through. That night, lying on his comfortable mattress under his warm blankets, listening to the coal stove crackle and other prisoners snore, Otto allows himself to think dangerous thoughts. If the Americans are not the monsters they were portrayed to be, if they feed prisoners and provide medical care and allow correspondence and generally behave like civilized human beings following international law, then what else has been a lie? If this part of the propaganda was false, how much more was fabricated? What other truths has Otto accepted without question that might crumble under examination? The transformation doesn't happen all at once. It accumulates in small moments, tiny erosions of certainty that together reshape understanding. It's the American guard who helps an elderly German prisoner carry his meal tray because the old man's hands shake too badly. It's the camp doctor who spends an hour extracting an infected tooth from a Wehrmacht sergeant, using real anesthetic, working with genuine skill to minimize pain. It's the Red Cross inspector, a neutral Swiss official, who tours the camp and confirms through his presence and his reports that everything is real, that this treatment is documented and internationally verified, that this is not an elaborate hoax but actual American policy. It's the second hot meal of the day, and the third, and the fourth, until Otto stops counting because regular meals simply become the new normal. It's the weight he begins to gain, flesh filling out the hollow spaces that months of Wehrmacht rations had carved into his frame. It's the clarity of thought that returns as adequate nutrition reaches his brain. It's the realization that he hasn't had dysentery in weeks, hasn't had to watch friends die from preventable diseases, hasn't seen the casual brutality that had become background noise in the German military. By December, a month after his arrival, Otto sits in the camp mess hall eating Christmas dinner, and the full weight of his transformation crashes down on him. The Americans have prepared a special meal for the German prisoners. Roasted chicken. Mashed potatoes with actual gravy. Green beans. Fresh bread with butter, real butter. Apple pie for dessert. The mess hall has been decorated with evergreen branches and paper chains made in the camp workshop. A small Christmas tree stands in the corner, and some prisoners have fashioned ornaments from scraps of material. American guards stand at their posts, but they're smiling, some humming Christmas carols, and the overall atmosphere feels less like a prison and more like a community celebration. Otto takes a bite of chicken and feels something break inside him. This is better than the last Christmas he spent with his family in 1941. This meal, served to prisoners of war in an enemy country, exceeds in quality and quantity the holiday dinner his wife managed to scrape together for their children that final peacetime Christmas before everything fell apart. The cognitive dissonance becomes unbearable. How can the enemy feed prisoners better than Germany feeds its own citizens? What kind of war is this where the losers eat roasted chicken while the winners, or at least the people who claim to be winning, survive on turnips and bread made from sawdust? Friedrich sits across from Otto, working through his own plate with mechanical precision. After several minutes of silence, Friedrich sets down his fork and meets Otto's eyes. In a voice barely above a whisper, Friedrich says what Otto has been thinking but hasn't dared to speak aloud. We were lied to about everything, weren't we? Otto doesn't respond immediately. To answer honestly is to betray everything he believed, everything he fought for, everything that gave his sacrifices meaning. But the chicken on his plate is real. The mattress waiting in his barracks is real. The medical care and the letters home and the basic human dignity are all real. And if these things are real, then the lies are real too. Otto slowly nods. Yes, he says. I think we were. Around them, hundreds of other German prisoners continue eating, each man conducting his own private negotiation with truth, each consciousness slowly bending under the weight of undeniable evidence. The promised brutality never came. The torture chambers don't exist. The starvation is absent. The savagery was a fiction. And in the space where those lies once lived, new questions are beginning to grow. Dangerous questions. Transformative questions. Questions that will eventually remake these men entirely, turning soldiers of the Reich into witnesses for a different kind of truth. But that transformation is still unfolding. Tonight, on Christmas Eve 1943, Otto Lehmann simply eats his chicken and allows himself to feel something he hasn't felt in years. Safe. For the first time since he put on a Wehrmacht uniform, Otto feels genuinely, physically safe. And that safety, more than any propaganda broadcast or political speech, begins the slow work of changing his mind about everything he thought he knew about enemies, allies, and the nature of civilization itself. The coal stove crackles. Snow begins to fall outside the barracks windows. And in a prison camp in Tennessee, hundreds of German soldiers discover that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a bomb, but simply the decision to treat human beings like human beings, even when they arrive as enemies. The winter of 1944 brought changes that extended far beyond seasonal shifts in weather. Camp Forest's population swelled to nearly 5,000 German prisoners as Allied victories in Italy in preparation for the coming invasion of France meant a steady stream of captured Wehrmacht soldiers flowing across the Atlantic. Each new arrival repeated the same psychological journey that Otto and Friedrich had traveled months earlier, the same disbelief, the same suspicion, the same gradual recognition that American treatment of prisoners bore no resemblance to the horror stories broadcast from Berlin. Otto found himself assigned to greeting committees, veteran prisoners tasked with helping newcomers adjust to the jarring reality of American captivity. The role required him to explain things that still felt impossible even after months of experience. Yes, the food is real and you'll receive 3 meals daily. Yes, the medical care is genuine and they'll treat your injuries without torture. Yes, you can write home and the letters actually get sent. Yes, the beds have mattresses and you'll sleep indoors with heat. The new prisoners would stare at Otto with the same haunted skepticism he remembered from his own arrival, certain this must be an elaborate trap, unable to reconcile propaganda promises of brutality with the mundane comfort of adequate food and shelter. One morning in late January, Otto met a prisoner who would fundamentally alter his understanding of how deeply the lies had penetrated German consciousness. Underoffizier Ernst Wagner arrived on a transport from the Italian front, his uniform still caked with mud from the fighting around Monte Cassino. Ernst was young, perhaps 22, with the hard eyes of someone who had seen too much death too quickly. During the intake process, Ernst refused food, pushing away the breakfast tray with shaking hands. Through the translator, he insisted the Americans were trying to poison him, that accepting enemy food was the first step in a brainwashing process designed to turn German soldiers into traitors. Otto sat with Ernst in the barracks that first night, speaking German for the first time in a conversation not monitored by translators, sharing the intimacy of their native tongue. Ernst's story emerged in fragments, interrupted by long silences and occasional tremors that suggested shell shock or something deeper. He had been conscripted at 18, sent to Italy at 19, and spent 3 years watching friends die in mountains and valleys whose names he couldn't pronounce. The propaganda officers visited his unit weekly, showing films and distributing pamphlets that described American prison camps as death factories where captured Germans were systematically exterminated through starvation, disease, and casual murder. The detail that struck Otto most forcefully was Ernst's absolute certainty that he would be dead within a week. Not afraid he might die, but convinced with mathematical precision that execution was inevitable. Ernst had been trained to believe that Americans took no prisoners, that surrender meant torture followed by death, that the only reason he remained alive 3 days after capture was to extract intelligence before the final bullet. Otto tried explaining the reality, gesturing at the warm barracks, the full stomachs around them, the obvious health of prisoners who had been here for months. Ernst listened with the glazed expression of someone hearing comfortable lies, unable or unwilling to accept evidence that contradicted everything his short brutal life had taught him. The breakthrough came on the 4th day when Ernst developed a fever. His body, weakened by years of inadequate rations and the stress of combat, succumbed to a respiratory infection that turned serious with frightening speed. Otto watched American medical staff transport Ernst to the camp hospital, saw the genuine concern on the doctor's face as he examined the young German, witnessed the administration of medications that were desperately scarce in Germany but apparently commonplace here. The doctor, a middle-aged man from somewhere in the American Midwest, spent 20 minutes listening to Ernst's lungs, checking his vital signs, and eventually starting an intravenous drip to combat dehydration. Ernst remained in the hospital for 6 days. During that time, he received round-the-clock nursing care, antibiotics that actually worked, regular meals adjusted for his illness, and treatment that would have been considered luxurious for German officers, let alone enlisted prisoners. When Ernst returned to the barracks, his fever broken and his strength returning, something fundamental had shifted in his eyes. The hard certainty had cracked. Otto saw confusion there now, and questions, and the beginning of a transformation that would eventually touch every man who passed through these gates. The medical statistics told a story that contradicted every assumption about enemy treatment of prisoners. Camp Forest maintained meticulous records, documented by both American administrators and neutral Swedish inspectors who visited quarterly to verify compliance with international law. Mortality rates among German prisoners stood at 0.3%, lower than the death rate in many American civilian communities and dramatically below the catastrophic losses German soldiers experienced on the Eastern Front. Common ailments like dysentery, typhus, and trench foot, diseases that ravaged German military units, were virtually eliminated in the camp through basic sanitation, adequate nutrition, and prompt medical intervention. The dental program revealed perhaps the starkest contrast between American prisoner treatment and German military standards. Camp Forest employed 2 full-time dentists who provided free dental care to all prisoners. German soldiers arrived with mouths full of rotting teeth, untreated cavities, and abscesses that had festered for months or years. The Wehrmacht had essentially abandoned dental care for enlisted men, considering it a luxury unnecessary for cannon fodder. American dentists extracted infected teeth, filled cavities, and in some cases provided dentures for prisoners whose dental health had deteriorated beyond repair. Otto had 3 cavities filled in his first 6 months of captivity, procedures performed with proper anesthetic and professional skill that exceeded any dental care he'd received as a civilian in Germany. The psychological impact of adequate healthcare extended beyond physical relief. Every interaction with American medical personnel provided evidence that undermined Nazi propaganda about American barbarism. How could a culture that provided free dental care to enemy prisoners be the subhuman savages described in party newspapers? How could doctors who worked diligently to save German lives be the monsters that Goebbels claimed would torture prisoners for sport? The contradictions accumulated until they became impossible to ignore, each medical appointment another brick removed from the wall of lies that had supported German ideological certainty. Food remained the most visceral daily reminder of the gap between propaganda and reality. Otto began keeping an informal journal, not of his thoughts, those were too dangerous to commit to paper even in the relative safety of American captivity, but of meals. The record became a numbing chronicle of abundance that felt obscene when Otto thought about his family surviving on rations in Hamburg. January 15, breakfast oatmeal with raisins, toast, coffee, orange. Lunch, vegetable soup, cheese sandwiches, cookies, milk. Dinner, pork chops, mashed potatoes, carrots, bread, apple cobbler. January 16, breakfast, scrambled eggs, sausage, biscuits with jam, coffee. Lunch, beef stew, cornbread, salad, pudding. Dinner, fried chicken, rice, green beans, rolls, cake. The monotony of plenty. Day after day, week after week, month after month, German prisoners received more food than many of them had seen during their entire military service. The American ration scale for prisoners actually exceeded the Wehrmacht ration scale for active combat soldiers. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't propaganda that required interpretation. This was measurable, weighable, undeniable reality. Otto's uniform, issued in November when he weighed 63 kilograms after months of poor rations in Italy and during transport, had to be exchanged for a larger size in March when he reached 71 kilograms. He was gaining weight in prison while his countrymen starved. the letters home became exercises in impossible translation. How could Otto explain to Maria that he ate meat daily when she wrote about standing in line for 4 hours to receive a half-pound of turnips? How could he describe the warm barracks when her letters mentioned sleeping in the U-Bahn tunnels during air raids because their apartment building had been destroyed? The disconnect between his reality and hers created a bizarre inversion where the prisoner lived better than the free citizen, where the defeated soldier enjoyed comforts denied to the civilians he'd fought to protect. Maria's letters arrived irregularly, delayed by military censorship and the chaos of a collapsing postal system, but each one provided a window into a Germany that Otto barely recognized. She wrote about streets full of rubble, about children with hunger-swollen bellies, about elderly neighbors who simply lay down and died because they lacked the strength to continue. She wrote about Nazi party officials who still received full rations while ordinary Germans scavenged for potato peels. She wrote about the constant fear of American bombers and the growing whispers that perhaps Germany was losing the war despite official proclamations of inevitable victory. Otto's responses became increasingly careful. He couldn't tell Maria the full truth about American treatment without endangering her. If Nazi authorities intercepted a letter describing abundant food and comfortable conditions in American prison camps, they might accuse Maria of spreading defeatist propaganda or question her loyalty to the Reich. So Otto wrote in careful code, mentioning that he remained healthy, that he was adequately fed, that he hoped the war would end soon so they could be reunited. He never mentioned the pork chops or the dental care or the warm mattress. He certainly never mentioned the thoughts that kept him awake at night, the growing suspicion that Germany deserved to lose this war, that the cause he'd fought for was not just doomed but fundamentally evil. The work assignments provided another vector for transformation. German prisoners labored on Tennessee farms that had lost men to the American military draft, helping harvest crops and maintain agricultural production. The work was physical but not punishing. Prisoners received the same lunch as American farmhands, worked similar hours, and were treated as temporary hired labor rather than slaves. Otto found himself assigned to a dairy farm owned by a family named Henderson, and the experience of working alongside American civilians completed the destruction of his ideological certainty. Sarah Henderson was 63 years old, widowed, running a 100-acre dairy operation with help from her 2 daughters and whatever labor she could hire or borrow. She had lost her only son at Pearl Harbor, a fact Otto learned from the translator on his first day at the farm. This woman had every reason to hate German prisoners, every justification for cruelty or casual abuse. Instead, she treated Otto and the 4 other German prisoners assigned to her farm with brisk efficiency and occasional kindness. She demonstrated how she wanted the milking done, corrected their mistakes without anger, and on cold mornings, provided hot coffee that she poured from the same thermos she drank from herself. The moment that shattered Otto's remaining certainty came on a March afternoon when one of the dairy cows went into difficult labor. Sarah worked for 2 hours trying to help the cow deliver, her arms shoulder-deep in blood and fluid, her face tight with concentration. When it became clear the calf was breached and the cow might die, she asked through the translator if any of the German prisoners had veterinary experience. Otto had grown up on a small farm outside Hamburg and had helped with difficult births before the war. He stepped forward, worked alongside Sarah for another hour, and together they managed to turn the calf and deliver it alive. The cow survived. The calf survived. And Sarah Henderson, whose son had died fighting Germany, clasped Otto's bloody hand and said something in English that the translator rendered as, "Thank you. You saved them both." Otto stood in that barn, covered in blood and birth fluid, holding the hand of an enemy widow who had just thanked him for saving her livestock, and felt the last foundations of his Nazi worldview crumble into dust. Sarah Henderson was not subhuman. She was not a monster. She was a farmer fighting to keep her land productive during wartime, showing the same practical competence and fundamental decency that Otto's own mother would have shown in similar circumstances. If Sarah could be German, and Germans could be American, then what did the categories even mean? What were they fighting for if the enemy was indistinguishable from the people they claimed to protect? The spring of 1944 brought news that changed everything. On June 6, Allied forces landed in Normandy, and the careful propaganda facade maintained by German authorities began to crack. Camp Forest received a flood of new prisoners captured during the French campaign, men who brought fresh stories of German defeats and growing Allied strength. The newcomers also brought updated propaganda, more desperate claims about American brutality designed to keep German soldiers fighting rather than surrendering. But these claims fell flat among prisoners who had months or years of personal experience contradicting every assertion about American savagery. Otto watched the integration of Normandy prisoners with a mixture of empathy and bitter amusement. He saw his own journey reflected in their faces, the same progression from terror to confusion to reluctant acceptance to eventual transformation. Some adapted quickly, recognizing within days that their expectations had been manufactured lies. Others resisted for weeks, maintaining ideological purity even as they grew healthier on American food and slept comfortably on American mattresses. A few never fully surrendered their Nazi beliefs, retreating into conspiracy theories that explained away all contradictory evidence as elaborate psychological warfare. But the majority eventually followed the path that Otto had walked. They ate the food because hungry bodies override ideology. They accepted medical care because pain has no politics. They wrote letters home because isolated men crave connection. They worked on American farms because idleness breeds madness. And slowly, through 1,000 small interactions and undeniable experiences, they began to question everything they had been taught about enemies and allies, superiority and inferiority, the nature of civilization itself. The statistics compiled by American authorities revealed the scope of transformation. By mid-1944, Camp Forest housed 4,873 German prisoners. Medical records showed that 94% had gained weight since arrival. Dental records indicated that 78% had received some form of dental care. Educational records showed that 62% were attending English language classes offered by the camp. Work records demonstrated that 89% were participating in labor programs with remarkably low rates of disciplinary problems or escape attempts. These weren't just numbers. They represented individual transformations multiplied across thousands of men, each one a small victory in the larger campaign to prove that democratic values could survive even the brutality of total war. The correspondence volume told its own story. German prisoners sent nearly 8,000 letters per month from Camp Forest alone, each one subject to military censorship that provided researchers with unprecedented insight into prisoner psychology. Early letters showed suspicion and residual propaganda. Later letters demonstrated growing appreciation for American treatment. The most recent letters, written by prisoners who had been in American custody for over a year, revealed fundamental ideological shifts. References to Nazi ideology dropped from 34% of letters in late 1943 to less than 8% by mid-1944. Mentions of adequate food, medical care, and fair treatment increased proportionally. The letters became testimonies, documents of transformation that would eventually reach thousands of German families and plant seeds of doubt about the regime they had supported. Otto's own correspondence with Maria evolved in parallel with his consciousness. His early letters had been cautious, saying little beyond the bare facts of his survival. By spring 1944, he was writing more openly, describing his work on the Henderson farm, mentioning that he received dental care, carefully noting that American treatment of prisoners seemed to follow international law. He never explicitly criticized the Nazi regime, that remained too dangerous, but his letters carried an undercurrent of disillusionment that Maria would recognize if she read between the lines. He wrote about hoping the war would end soon, about wondering what peace might look like, about the strange experience of working alongside people who should have been enemies but felt increasingly like neighbors. Maria's responses suggested she understood. Her letters became subtly more honest about conditions in Germany, about the growing certainty among ordinary citizens that the war was lost, about the quiet rage at Nazi officials who had promised victory and delivered only death and destruction. She wrote about mothers whose sons had died on the Eastern Front, about families who had lost everything in bombing raids, about the growing sense that Germany had been betrayed by leaders who cared more about ideology than the survival of the German people. The correspondence between Otto and Maria became a private rebellion, two people carefully communicating truths that could not be spoken openly, building a shared understanding that would eventually help them navigate the catastrophe of Germany's defeat. The summer brought intensified work demands as American farms faced critical labor shortages during the growing season. Otto and his fellow prisoners worked longer hours, but the conditions remained humane. They received adequate water, regular breaks, and meals that provided enough calories for physical labor. The Henderson farm became Otto's second home, a place where he felt oddly comfortable despite the strangeness of the situation. Sarah Henderson's daughters, both women in their 30s with husbands serving overseas, treated the German prisoners with the same practical courtesy their mother showed. They offered no friendship, the wounds of war were too fresh for that, but they demonstrated a basic respect that acknowledged shared humanity beneath the uniforms and nationalities. On a July afternoon, while Otto was repairing fence line on the far edge of the Henderson property, one of the daughters brought water to the work crew. Her name was Elizabeth, and she spoke a few words of German learned from a grandmother who had immigrated decades earlier. In halting, uncertain phrases, Elizabeth asked Otto where he was from, if he had family, how he had ended up in Tennessee. Otto answered carefully, describing Hamburg and Maria and their 2 children in terms that emphasized ordinariness. He was not a Nazi ideologue or a war criminal. He was a conscripted soldier who had done what his government demanded and now found himself impossibly far from home, working on a farm that reminded him painfully of the life he had known before the war destroyed everything. Elizabeth listened, then said something in her broken German that Otto would remember for the rest of his life. She said her brother had probably killed men like Otto. She said Otto had probably killed men like her brother. She said the whole thing was a horrible waste and she hoped it would end soon so everyone could go home and rebuild their lives. Then she handed Otto the water jug and walked back toward the farmhouse, leaving him standing in the Tennessee heat with tears running down his face and the taste of cold well water sharp on his tongue. That evening, back in the barracks at Camp Forest, Otto lay on his mattress and stared at the ceiling and allowed himself to fully confront what he had become. He was no longer a loyal German soldier. He was no longer a believer in the Nazi cause. He was no longer certain about anything except that the war had been a monstrous mistake and that the people he had been taught to hate were fundamentally no different from the people he had been taught to love. The Americans had defeated him without firing a shot, had conquered his ideology without torture or brainwashing, had won his allegiance through the simple revolutionary act of treating him like a human being. The transformation was complete. What came next would determine whether that transformation mattered, whether one man's changed consciousness could ripple outward to influence anything beyond his own private moral universe. But tonight, Otto Lehmann simply accepted the truth that had been building for 8 months. The enemy had shown him more humanity than his own government ever had. And that fact, more than any military defeat or territorial loss, meant that Germany had already lost the only war that ultimately mattered, the war for the souls of its own people. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.